Hey guys, so we're going to be looking at this two-parter from Historia Civilis about Charles. Can monarchs commit crimes? And the sequel is the trial of Charles the First. So, wait, let me see if I have it right here. Okay, so I was kind of like looking a bit into this because I am aware of Charles. I knew that he, obviously beefed with, I believe it was Parliament, and then it started a civil war. A civil war broke out in England, and it ended up with him losing, being tried, and then being killed. And then, Oliver Cromwell, I believe, is a huge part of it. Um, so that was really the basic surface level crap I knew. Some personal research I've done. So here are some notes I took. If any of these are wrong, then I'm gonna go back to the random articles I found and like hated. But so basically, King Charles the First older brother Henry dies, making him the heir apparent. He didn't have the most charismatic, likable personality, possible shyness. He upset Parliament due to stubbornness and not really listening to the input of others. Believed in the divine right of kings, which basically means kings were chosen by God and only God could refuse them. Charles wanted complete control and Parliament wasn't cool with that. This instigates civil war and Charles loses, gets arrested, tried, and eventually executed. So that's just some, again, surface level stuff I wrote down, and I'm sure there's plenty more to it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it. So yeah, we should probably just get right into it, huh? Let's find out, can monarchs commit crimes by Historia Civilis?
I want to talk about one of the most important trials, human trials, in the history of the planet. It took place in January of the year 1649 before a newly created body called the High Court of Justice. The charges? Tyranny, treason, and murder. The defendant? The King of England. This trial helped to write the legal doctrine of popular sovereignty, which is the idea that political legitimacy emanates from the people. It's a simple idea, but it stood in stark contrast with another legal doctrine, which argued that political legitimacy emanated from God through the institution of monarchy. This was called divine right. Generally speaking, these two ideas stood in opposition to each other. Popular sovereignty was bottom-up, divine right was top-down. This theoretical disagreement over the source of political legitimacy resulted in several centuries of troubles? And one of these troubles was the thing called the English Civil War. The capstone to the English Civil War was that thing I want to talk about, the trial of Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Trial of the century doesn't begin to describe it. This would be the trial of the millennia. But in order to fully appreciate what was to come, some context is required. The English Civil War is notoriously complex. Some would say boring, but I would say complex. I promise to be brief. King Charles I, separately and simultaneously the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, believed that political legitimacy emanated from God and manifested through the crown. Divine right. A consequence of this belief is that Charles saw other sources of political power as a diminishment of his own royal authority. He therefore did everything in his power to reign without ever consulting with Parliament. This was tricky because without the consent of Parliament, you couldn't tax the people of England. To compensate for this, the king raised revenue in a number of creative ways, such as diverting money that was intended for the navy, as well as arbitrarily demanding loans from the nobility and throwing them in prison when they refused. This was exactly as popular as you might think. In time, Scotland rose in rebellion. At last, after avoiding Parliament for 11 long years, Charles was forced to, in his eyes, diminish his royal authority by asking them for funds to raise an army. Parliament was furious. Instead of giving the king his army, they went right for the jugular. They outlawed his creative means of raising revenue, and then charged some of his closest political allies with treason. A short time later, Ireland rose in rebellion. Parliament then took things up a notch and tried to take control of the military away from the king. For Charles, this was the final straw. He ordered 5 of the most radical members of Parliament arrested. Parliament refused to give up their own, and there was a standoff. When they asked the local militia to seize the capital, the king fled north, and England was engulfed in a civil war.
Holy crap. So, if 11 years of not consulting Parliament, how exactly does that work? Like, Parliament, did they just meet and, like, just discuss stuff while the king was doing whatever he wanted? Like, it seems wild to me that he did not talk, or that... I'm assuming someone must have brought it up, right? Hey, what about Parliament? I imagine he's probably like, heck no. But, yeah, this is just straight up, like... It's interesting, the situation in England. I never fully looked into it, but while other places in the world still had almost complete, monarchies in terms of their power and practice of power, the idea of Parliament and its relationship with the king is something that I haven't looked too deep into it myself, but I've heard some things, and just like, in a weird way, it kind of did, well, I guess limit, in a sense, what a king could do. Again, I'm not completely aware of everything. I could have even gotten that wrong, but it is just an interesting, like, other governmental body to serve along the king, and that could even, like, hamper the king's powers or what he wants to do. So I don't know, I just find the idea of Parliament, it's sort of unique with England. I mean, I'm sure there are probably other places in the world with something like this, but I also know that, like, absolute monarchies were a thing for a lot of places as well. By the way, if my voice sounds super weak, I apologize. I just got back from somewhere. So I'm not gonna lie, my voice is super weak, or at least I feel tired. My voice feels tired, but you know what? That's not gonna stop me from making a YouTube video and reacting to Historia Civilis, so let's get to it.
The fighting dragged on for 4 years, leading to an unprecedented level of mobilization. The English Civil War became, and remains, the deadliest conflict in English history, twice as deadly as World War I on a per capita basis. An entire generation of...
Holy crap. More than World War I? That's insane. How did I not know this? I've never heard much topics on this Civil War, so that's insane. It kind of reminds me, like, here in America, I think the most deadly conflict is our Civil War, obviously on American soil, because a lot of Americans died there. So, I guess it kind of reigns supreme. I guess it's the similar situation in England, but more than World War I thing.
Men and women were profoundly radicalized by this event. Charles was eventually forced to flee up into Scottish-occupied territory, where he was captured and then handed over to Parliament. The king escaped and fled to the Isle of Wight, where he was captured for a second time. From captivity, Charles was able to convince a sympathetic Scottish army to invade England, setting off a wave of royalist uprisings across the countryside. Let's pause here, because this would become an important point. After the people of England suffered World War I-sized casualties, the King of England turned around and asked another country to invade.
That is so... it's so devious. I love that. Dude gets caught and it says, hey, can you invade my kingdom, please? Like, my... that's hilarious.
To the already radicalized English people, angry doesn't begin to describe it. Their own king had just stabbed them in the back. At great cost, the parliamentarians fought what was basically a second civil war, eventually defeating the Scots and quelling the uprisings. That brings us up to September of the year 1648. Parliament had just won 2 civil wars, and the king was imprisoned on the Isle of Wight. The problem was that nobody knew what to do next. Parliament was made up of 2 distinct bodies, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and unsurprisingly given the context of the Civil War, the House of Commons had been the ones driving the agenda. The Commons was split into 2 factions. The larger of the 2 was the moderate faction, who favored squeezing some religious reforms out of Charles, reducing his political power, and restoring him to the throne. The Independents, on the other hand, named after their desire for independence from the Church of England, wanted to go much further. They had a long list of demands, including a call for a brand new electoral system, where poor people were actually given the right to vote, a radical idea for the time. You might notice that there was no royalist or conservative faction. The Civil War had seen to that. So the Commons were split between the moderates and the independents, with the moderates running the show. But the really interesting dynamic is that the English army was also split. The officers generally favored the moderates, while the rank and file, radicalized by the Civil War, mostly favored the independents. This made for a complicated political situation. But of course, there were heterodox views within each of these groups, especially within army leadership. Lord Fairfax was the commander-in-chief of the army, firmly in the moderate camp, favoring a negotiated settlement with the king. Oliver Cromwell was Fairfax's second-in-command, and kinda had a foot in each faction. He sided with the independents when it came to their radical religious reforms. He was quite religious himself. But he also sided with the moderates when it came to forcing political reforms upon the king and restoring him to the throne. Or at least that's what he had believed. The experience with the Scottish invasion had changed Cromwell, and
Yeah, there's a movie starring Alec Guinness as Charles I. I haven't watched the movie, though I've seen a scene. You could find it on YouTube, like King Charles enters Parliament, and it's an interesting thing. And, you know, I've heard of Cromwell. Like, Cromwell and Charles I are probably the only 2 people of this entire situation that I know of, or at least knew of before even watching this video. And usually he's kind of portrayed as the guy who really wanted to kill the king and, you know, set up something else. Again, you know, that's just offhandedly what I've heard and seen. There's so much more to it, I'm sure. And I really like watching these videos to kind of gain that new perspective, you know what I mean? So this is interesting to already learn about this figure. I just assumed he would instantly be solely independent, right?
he was no longer certain that the English people could trust their own sovereign. Henry Ireton was another high-ranking general, and Cromwell's son-in-law. Ireton favored radical political reforms, which made him an independent. He was a firebrand, and he wasn't shy about speaking out against the monarchy and the nobility. One contemporary described him as having, quote, the principles and temper of a Cassius. Cassius? We actually...
It's not really a good thing, though. I mean, Cassius is kind of, his name is synonymous with betrayal, isn't it? Right up there with Brutus and Judas, so you know.
Actually know what that means. But nothing's that simple. Despite being broadly aligned on policy, the independents in the Commons kept on denouncing Ireton for various philosophical disagreements. For example, the most radical of the radicals argued that private property was an invention of the crown, and so if the crown went away, private property should return to the hands of the people. Ireton disagreed with this, which led to him perpetually being cancelled by his closest political allies. But for the time being, this fighting among the independents didn't really matter, because the House of Commons was controlled by the moderates. They decided to send representatives from each faction to the Isle of Wight to negotiate with the king. This team of negotiators was initially quite successful. They got Charles to agree that Parliament had gone to war in its just and lawful defense, which meant that everybody who had fought in the Civil War would be immune from prosecution. A big win. They also got him to agree to a whole host of political reforms. Parliament would be fully autonomous, with the ability to pick the king's ministers and implement their own policy. These were huge concessions. The independents wanted radical political reforms, and it looked like they were going to get them. The moderates wanted to restore the king to the throne in a reduced capacity, and it looked like they were going to get that too.
But like, can they really get both what they want and be happy? Like, it seems like there's gonna be some overlap, right? This is going too well right now. I think I'm just waiting for the moment things just drop, you know? And I feel like Charles is saying yeah to everything, because does he really have a choice? He's been caught. He lost. Like, can he really just say no? Like, I don't know. I don't know why.
Settlement seemed within reach. But then, the negotiators made a key discovery. The king was an unreliable partner. He would make a big concession, and the next day he would take it back. They were forced to go over the same points.
Okay, I see. Charles, a little devious there, my man.
Again and again and again. The king seemed to be playing for time. When it came to religion, the two sides could not make any progress. The negotiators, particularly the independents, wanted the Church of England to get rid of bishops and become more egalitarian. This, the king would not do. He would agree to a partial set of reforms that would expire after 3 years, but nothing more. This wasn't enough for the independents. A less hierarchical Church of England was central to their ideology. As discussions dragged into their second month, the negotiators began to lose hope. At one point, 2 of the moderates got down on their knees and begged the king to just give in to their demands. If these negotiations failed, they said, the army, full of bloodthirsty radicals, would have no choice but to intervene. They might not bother negotiating. While this was going on, Ireton was urging the higher-ups within the army to break off negotiations and arrest the king. Ireton and others worried that the rich people in the House of Commons were going to sell out the poor people in the army by restoring the king to power. Ireton found some support among the officers, but Fairfax, an aristocrat himself, remained steadfastly moderate. In frustration, Ireton began going around and gathering public support for a long list of radical demands, which included putting the king on trial, abolishing the monarchy, and replacing the House of Commons with something else that better represented England's poor. He was quite successful. Public opinion began to shift, and the idea of putting the king on trial became quite popular, especially within the army. Fairfax and his moderate allies started to become nervous. After several days of debate, they decided to speed things along by presenting their own list of demands to the king. What they wanted was basically a military dictatorship, with the king's 8-year-old son on the throne as a puppet. Charles did the right thing and flatly turned them down. This was a big deal. Fairfax had just stabbed the negotiators in the back. When news broke, the House of Commons and the army were immediately at each other's throats. Events were moving quickly now. If the House of Commons came after the army, things might devolve into a third civil war. Caught between a rock and a hard place, Fairfax did the politically savvy thing and publicly threw his support behind the radical independents in the House of Commons. The moderates were now caught between the independent minority and the army. They agreed to vote on some of the more radical independent demands, like putting the king on trial, but then they delayed and delayed and delayed again. It quickly became clear that the moderates were playing for time. The negotiators on the Isle of Wight were days from an agreement. On December 1st, Fairfax made his move. A bunch of soldiers showed up on the Isle of Wight with orders to bring the king to the mainland. The negotiators protested, but they had no means to resist. Fairfax had seized the king. On the next day, the army marched on London. When the House of Commons learned what was happening, the most moderate of the moderates packed up and fled the city. Fairfax had a tiger by the tail here. He was personally a moderate, but his army was out for blood. He believed that if he moved quickly and forced a harsh settlement upon the king, he might be able to save the monarchy. Maybe. If not, the nobility might be next. Revolution was in the air. Within days, Fairfax had occupied the capital. On the morning of December 6th, a bunch of soldiers, led by a guy named Colonel Thomas Pride, posted up just outside the House of Commons. When members of Parliament started showing up, Pride checked their names against a list and refused to let any of the moderates inside. Things got out of hand pretty quickly. Some of the members tried to force their way into the building, at which point they were arrested by Pride's men and taken away. This event is known to history as Pride's Purge. In total, over 200 members were expelled from the House of Commons, including 45 who were arrested. Many of those who were turned away saw the writing on the wall and fled the city. This new, purged House of Commons was less than half of its original size. People were terrified, and many feared that the purges were not over. In the weeks that followed, most people stopped showing up to the Commons. A legislative body that had once had approximately 500 members now met with sometimes as few as 40. The army had pulled off a coup d'etat. Critics of this new...
Holy crap, that was a huge power move right there. That's insane. Yeah, I'm sorry for my silence, because like I said, other than a very, very surface level understanding of Charles and his situation, I don't know anything about this. Which I really love watching Historia Civilis break down the political situations of certain things, like, you know, again, English politics I'm not fully aware of. I do know of Parliament because I've heard it, but what that entails, obviously, I've never really looked deep into in English history. So this is all just new to me and completely fascinating. And I do believe that, yeah, Charles does get executed, and then for a while the English monarchy is abolished, I think, but it comes back. So I don't know, I'm sure we'll get there, but yeah.
The legislative body called it the Rump Parliament, and the name stuck. But here's the thing. Fairfax did not order Colonel Pride to do this. Pride was acting on Ireton's orders. Fairfax was furious. This was not what he wanted. His plan had backfired. When Cromwell, Fairfax's second-in-command, voiced his support for Pride's purge, Fairfax had no choice but to follow suit. He had effectively lost control of his army. The radicals were running the show now, and they were looking to Cromwell and Ireton for leadership.
Well, I have to give it to Fairfax. The dude was really trying there, but moderates never win, do they? Like, I swear, every, like governmental usurpation, like, with the French Revolution, moderates are always the ones who usually play second fiddle to the more radical lies. Like, I've never heard of the moderates winning over radicals. Then again, I'm not well versed in every, so I don't know if we could call this a revolution, but it kind of is similar to one, but yeah. Fairfax tried though. I kind of applaud him, but yeah, I imagine the radicals are just gonna go unhinged now, as they usually do when they come into power, right?
This new Rump Parliament, finally free of moderate influence, immediately got to work. On January 1st, 1649, they passed a bill establishing a new 135-member tribunal called the High Court of Justice. This body would be empowered to put the king on trial, with its members acting as both judges and jury. Fairfax, Cromwell, and Ireton were all appointed to the tribunal, with the rest being split between radical independents from the commons and officers from the army. The legislation also called for a Lord President of the High Court of Justice, who would be responsible for the day-to-day running of the trial. They first went to some of the top legal minds in England, who explained to them that what they were proposing was almost certainly treason. They later found a local judge by the name of John Bradshaw, who openly favored abolishing the monarchy, and appointed him to the role. But there was a problem. The House of Lords, which was made up of prominent members of the church and the nobility, refused to ratify the creation of this tribunal. On January 4th, the rump in the House of Commons passed a resolution declaring that all legitimate political power flowed from the people, which meant that the House of Commons had the right to exercise full sovereign authority over all of England.
So the House of Commons has just taken it, like, we established in the beginning, obviously, the House of Lords, which I was like, they're being awfully quiet. What are they doing during all this? I'm glad he brought it up. So, but it seems like to me that, yeah, the Commons just going for it. The full-on radicalness is going on, which I'm like, oh, snap. And obviously there's some bias, because they found a judge who was like, completely willing to get rid, or who believes the monarchy should be overthrown, so it almost comes across kind of like a sham or a show, you know? I don't know.
Popular sovereignty. Now things were really cooking. According to the Rump Parliament, the House of Lords and the King were politically irrelevant. Anything passed through the Commons became law. When the King learned...
Yeah, they just overthrew the King's say in politics in the House of Lords, which is insane. It would be like if one branch of government in the US just said, the others are irrelevant now, you know, we're taking it, like, the House of Representatives, like, I got all that, I'm sorry, but, you know, it's funny, because I do agree with the idea that, you know, the power should be for the people, that the people and who they decide should go is there, again, you know, being from the United States, obviously, and with a more modern sensibility, as opposed to, is this the medieval era? Like, the medieval England, obviously, that's a foreign thing, but I think, like, here in America, it's like, yeah, people should have say who gets elected and who does, like, it's funny, because I agree with that, you know, yet I have a weird aversion towards the way these guys are operating in a weird, funny way. I don't know. That's interesting.
What the Commons had done, he said in utter disbelief that no law existed under which a king could be charged with a crime. He was right, but it didn't matter. They would put him on trial anyway. On January 8th, the High Court of Justice met behind closed doors to discuss bringing charges against the king. By now, it was clear that Fairfax had lost control of his army, and from this point forward, he rarely attended meetings. Cromwell was in charge now. King Charles had asked a Scottish army to invade England, and so the tribunal started things off by throwing around the word treason. One member, named Sidney, caused a bit of a panic when he explained to the group that a king could not commit treason because the technical definition of treason was violence against the king. And even if that wasn't true, the High Court of Justice had been established illegally, without the consent of the House of Lords. Cromwell, when he heard this,
Holy crap, that's pretty brave of Sidney to just say that. But that also seems dangerous among radicals. Though, props on, like, stating the facts, though. But then again, also, I find myself, like, what Charles did was really kind of messed up. He asked a foreign power to invade his country that he lost. That's also kind of like, what the heck? I don't know, I'm having weird feelings at the moment. Like, I get what some of the Commons are saying, and I agree with some of their thinking, but at the same time, what Charles is also saying, I agree with some of it, and also, with both sides, I also don't agree with something. this is weird. I'm like not fully on anyone's side or at the moment. I'm in this weird, like, I don't know how else to put it. I'm a bit torn at the moment. Like, this is, I don't think I've remembered anything that's made me think like this before, huh? Or made me feel like this, rather. So that's interesting.
Burst out in anger. I tell you, we will cut off his head with the crown on it. Sidney responded, I cannot stop you, but I will keep myself clean from having any hand in this business. The tribunal pushed forward without Sidney. It was not immediately clear what kinds of crimes a king could be guilty of, and over several days they discussed every conceivable scenario. They considered charging the king with the murder of every person killed over the course of the Civil War. They considered charging him with gross incompetence for the mismanagement of the English Navy. They considered charging him with the murder of his own father, the former king. This was a totally made-up thing, but it was convenient for their purposes because it actually met the technical definition of treason. After agonizing over these questions, the tribunal agreed on a specific set of charges that accused the king of being a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer who sought to subvert the fundamental laws and liberties of the nation. As an olive branch to the moderates, the tribunal agreed to limit themselves to actual crimes that had taken place during the Civil War. Nothing about the king murdering his own father. These charges hinted at some fundamental questions. Could a king commit treason against his own kingdom? Where did political legitimacy come from? If the people rejected their king, was he still a king? These questions will be answered with the trial of King Charles I.
Those are some interesting questions that I'm even thinking of at the moment. Wait, is he done? Okay. That was beyond fascinating. I find there's a weird bit of nuance. Is that the word I'm looking for? I don't think so. But we'll just go with it for now. Nuance to this whole conflict, and I'm like, I kind of get where both sides are sort of coming from. I don't know. Like, I can kind of agree and also be like, it's a bit much on both sides. I don't know. That this is an interesting thing. I'm looking forward to just, you know what, let's just jump to the next video. It'll come out tomorrow, around the same time, so I'll see you guys tomorrow, and we'll talk more about this then. Bye, everyone.